Right, good evening, everyone. My name is Kelsey Moss, and I am a graduate. Is that better?
Yes.
Okay. My name is Kelsey Moss, and I'm a graduate student here at Princeton in the Department of Religion. I want to take a second to thank Wallace, the presenters, and the conference organizers for all of their hard work in bringing this gathering to fruition and for making space for these rich and provocative conversations. Tonight, I have the pleasure of introducing our keynote speaker, Professor Elizabeth Alexander. Professor Alexander has had a distinguished career as a poet, essayist, playwright, scholar, and teacher. She earned a PhD in English from the University of Pennsylvania, a master's degree from Boston University, and a bachelor's degree from Yale University. Professor Alexander's accomplishments within academia are numerous. She is currently the Woon Soon Tam Mellon Professor in the Humanities at Columbia University. She also taught with distinction at the University of Chicago, where she won the Quantrell Award for Excellence in Undergraduate Teaching. At New York University, where she taught in the Graduate Creative Writing Program, and Smith College, where she was the Grace Hazard Conkling Poet in Residence and Director of the Poetry Center. She was on the faculty of Yale University for 15 years and served as the chair of Yale's African American Studies Department. She has received numerous awards, fellowships, and honorary degrees, among them grants from the Guggenheim Foundation and the National Endowment for the Arts. She received the Anisfield Wolf Award for Lifetime Achievement in Poetry and is the inaugural recipient of the Jackson Poetry Prize. She also received fellowships from the Radcliffe Institute at Harvard and the Alphonse Fletcher Foundation. Professor Alexander's career as a writer and poet has been equally impressive. Literary critic Arnold Rampersad, who we have in our presence this evening, called Alexander, quote, one of the brightest stars in our literary sky, a superb, invaluable commentator on the American scene. And the poet Clarence Major has described Alexander's, quote, instinct for turning her profound cultural vision into one that illuminates universal experience, end quote. Her writing explores such subjects as race, gender, politics, art, and history. She has authored several books of poetry and collections of essays. Her 2005 book of poetry, entitled American Sublime, was shortlisted for the Pulitzer Prize. Among her acclaimed essays, Can You Be Black and Look at This, Reading the Rodney King Videos, and Meditations on Mecca, Gwendolyn Brooks and the Responsibilities of the Black Poet have enlivened the debate on the role of art and social justice and addressed issues of race, representation, violence, and the vulnerable Black body. Alexander is also an important voice in African American literary criticism. Her writings on artists, writers, and aesthetics are valued for their poise and erudition. In 2009, Alexander composed and delivered Praise Song for the Day for the inauguration of President Barack Obama, becoming only the fourth poet to read her poetry at an American presidential inauguration, joining the ranks of Robert Frost, Maya Angelou, and Miller Williams. Alexander's recent memoir, entitled The Light of the World, was released to widespread acclaim in 2015 and was also a finalist for the Pulitzer Prize. Professor Alexander currently serves as the Director of Creativity and Free Expression at the Ford Foundation. There she shapes and directs Ford's grant-making in arts, media, and culture. She guides the Foundation's efforts to examine how cultural narratives affect and shape social movements and how media and the arts, including film and visual storytelling, can contribute to a fairer and more just society. Professor Elizabeth Alexander's careful poetry and her awareness of and commitment to history, especially African American history, have helped her to make her one of the most publicly known and respected poets writing today. She has offered us innumerable tools to think about the power of poetry to spark collective imaginations and offer us ways through and forward during difficult times. There is no one better to speak to us this evening as we reflect on the art, life, and legacy of Langston Hughes. Without further ado, please join me in welcoming Professor Elizabeth Alexander.
Thank you so much. How are we doing on sound? Good? Super. Hello, everybody. I'm really happy to be here with you tonight. I'm very honored to be here to talk about the legacy of Langston Hughes. And I'm especially happy to be in a room full of friends, and some of you are my lifelong friends. And some of you are my lifelong friends because as we've moved through this life together, one of the things that we've held dear is the culture and the poetry of our people, and that is part of why we love each other. So it's wonderful to be with all of you today. And I've prepared my keynote in the form of propositions, 10 propositions about the might and reach of our Langston. And the title is 10 Propositions on Langston. 1, Overture. And before I start, let me also just say that I really thought a lot about legacy. So you'll see that that's what I'm thinking about. So when I talk about myself, it's because I'm talking about the ways that I have walked and lived with Langston, and I'm going to talk about other poets who are a way that we can understand and measure his influence moving forward from his times. So 1, Overture, Langston as perennial. Perennial Langston is our overture for what I think that we see in everyone's work on the program, and certainly in my own meditating on Langston, both for today and over the years, is that he is a lifelong companion. There is work that speaks to so many modes and occasions, states of mind, worldview, and aesthetics. The enviable clarity of his work belies its infinite complexity. I can't believe that it was 2002 when at Yale we held a Langston Hughes conference, and there I gave an address at a very different point in my thinking and in my life. The paper that I wrote then was my first foray into the archive post back-to-back children. And I remember it well for that reason, and I remember the triumph of feeling that though my life had earthquaked to make room for these delightful, soul-stirring, and consuming creatures, that there was still infinite mystery and discovery and joy in the research and thinking and writing from the archive. I wrote then about Langston Hughes as anthologizer, still a favorite topic, and his editing of New Negro Poets USA across the late 1950s to 1964, and those changing landscapes in American culture. I also remember in my time doing research at the Beinecke, where, as we all know, his extraordinary papers are housed, that in those short, intense hours between child duties, I would go in and I would do my work. And one time when I went in, there was a desk guard who was a little bit overzealous in interrogating my identification. Even though I taught at Yale at the time, the kind of indignity that we are used to moving past. I tell you this story not for the indignity, but rather for the beautiful save. That one of the guards at the Beinecke, who was African American, as so many of the gentlemen who safekeep American treasures, came forth and said, "That's Professor Alexander, and she is here because she is writing a paper about Langston Hughes." He was standing up for me, but more importantly, his sense of owned pride in the work of Afro-America's bard was bright shining in that moment. And that anecdote is a small illustration of why we are here and how Langston belongs to us and we belong to Langston. In that essay I wrote, we all have our Langstons, the Langstons usually first encountered in childhood through poetry. The work of Langston Hughes has for several generations of readers helped form a sense of an American poetics and the possibility of an African American literature. Especially for many young black readers of more than one generation, Hughes's work presents a race pride moment par excellence. He is our poet laureate, our Shakespeare in Harlem, our Negro man of letters who made his living by the word and who articulated racial issues and strivings through a lens of true love for black people. In addition to being the best known, most read, and most frequently taught African American, and in many cases American poet, and actually that was 15 years ago, and we could say some different things now, I think, Langston Hughes is also the rare poet for whom one could easily conjure a picture. Think of those lovely early studio portraits or any number of later images, the photograph with a cigarette dangling from his mouth, this is the Panther and the Lash, which I'm going to talk about in a little bit, at the typewriter from the cover of the small, fat selected poems, or the famous poet of the Negro busboy, photo of the Negro busboy poet, newly discovered by Vachel Lindsay, or the picture of him in profile and quietly joyful on a Senegalese beach at the 1966 World African Arts Conference in Dakar. We even call him Langston, as though something in that face and those poems has invited us to do so. So, in thinking about, in these 10 propositions, this still the overture, what he has made possible, we will sometimes veer into the personal to get a wide sense of the possibility that Langston has opened up in world letters. I think that in Arnold Rampersad's extraordinary biography, I'm so happy that you're here, Arnold. Where are you? There you are. I'm talking to you and you alone. We have that trove, we have that gift, and I think that what we also see is a poet who you have uncovered for us, but who sometimes turns from the first person in his own work in really interesting ways. And I think that now we're in a different moment, so there's kind of, an aim to bringing an I in real time into these remarks. 2, Langston as experimental poet. We name the experimental as we name any quality, moment, school, or movement in literature, in large part from the vantage point of today. So what appears to be doctrinaire, even hegemonic from here and now, might well have had to fight to make its space in its time. We now take for granted Langston Hughes's forging poetic form from jazz and the blues. There have been so many practitioners in the jazz blues poem mode, from the sublime to the ridiculous, that its status as form is now a given. But when a young Hughes was making those first poems in the 1920s, the forms, the vessels that brought those musics into the muscle and bone of poems simply did not exist. Hughes was a radical innovator who made poems that managed to sound natural, inevitable, and almost artless in their very artfulness, and I mark that as poetic innovation. Though Gwendolyn Brooks's sonnets are cast in her specific idiom and syntax, they still look like sonnets and sometimes don't appear to be as groundbreaking as they are. But Brooks was an acolyte of Hughes's, was able to listen to and interpolate the voices of Chicago's South Side into a modernist sonnet in a new black idiom. And to this day, there are no Brooks imitators who have surpassed or significantly revised her contributions. I really believe that. Try though we do. And the case of Robert Hayden, of course, his work profoundly respected in many circles. We could get into many things about Hayden, but I want to talk about poems like Frederick Douglass and Middle Passage, landmark poems of black resistance, and to look at Middle Passage the way that Hayden brought documentary material from ship logs into the poetic text of Middle Passage was sui generis. To cut and recontextualize and bring new meaning to those slave logs that is in fact evidence of the wretched human crime of the slave trade was the innovation of this work. The despised information is made into art, its factuality neither erased nor neutralized. This is a historical poem, after all, which believes in telling a story, but its material has been used to make an instrument towards the destruction of its ideology. And so, in thinking about opening up the experimental in black poetry, defining it a little bit differently, how might we think about Brooks's In the Mecca, for example, redefining epic and urban and disrupting all romance about the black community? How does Sonia Sanchez bring keen and wail, a woman's individual cries and the cries of a community, as actual marked space into her poems, and what is made possible in the wake of those poems? And so that's how I want us to be able to think about Langston Hughes and about how what he did opened up a tributary that takes us forward down an experimental line in a way that sometimes is not how he is thought about. So the specific question that I want to press is, what are some other ways we can define black experimentalism, and how does Langston Hughes's work let us think about that? This is a salvo, a group project, an invitation. What genealogy of black poetry derives from Langston Hughes? I think we've talked about this in many individual cases, but I'm urging us to think about what a real mapping would look like. Thinking, for example, the koan as form in his poem Luck, and how its mysteries are a tributary that leads us to Lucille Clifton. So that's what I want to think about with Langston Hughes as experimental poet. 3, Langston Hughes as Puerto Rican. could laugh a little bit. It's like a little bit funny. When Langston was a child and then a young man, his father moved to Mexico, and he would visit him in Toluca and Temexcaltepec in the summers. The trip with his dyspeptic father was, in Arnold's words, quote, just have to read this paragraph, "The journey to Mexico was a dull horror. To James Hughes, a bitter man, the United States was so much sandpaper on his nerves." In Arkansas, Langston saw a picturesque scene, some blacks at work in a cotton field. "Look at the niggers," Jim Hughes sneered. Once past the adobe border station in Laredo, he spat his contempt at Mexican laborers. Baffled, Langston tried to see the laborers as his father saw them. He loved the poor. His father seemed actually to hate them. So I want to just, it's a simple reminder, but what do you get when we remind ourselves that Langston Hughes, as a very young man, spoke Spanish? What do we say, and I'm being irreverent when I say, he grew up in the Spanish language. He grew up in literature written in Spanish. He grew up teaching English to people in Mexico. He grew up, when you grow up in another language, I would argue that it allows you to begin to understand yourself as a diasporic person. So the Puerto Rican joke is then you come to Harlem and become a lover of Harlem. So therefore, what does it all add up to? So I'm being a little bit funny, but I'm also trying to say that there's a marked diasporicness in Langston Hughes that from the beginning, because he's also listening to Indian languages, native languages that he doesn't understand when he's in Mexico. He brings with him that understanding that whether your native people call themselves Arawaks or Tainos or Siboneyes, and whether your Africans were Yoruba or Igbo or Hausa, and whether or not the ship you were on went to Haiti or Puerto Rico or Cuba or the Dominican Republic or South Carolina, that we are talking about and that whether the people who enslaved you spoke English or French or Portuguese or Spanish. That we're talking about a diasporic understanding that when alchemized, it gives you a way of understanding yourself in the world, and that I think is part of why such a very young man could write such a knowing poem like The Negro Speaks of Rivers. I've known rivers ancient as the world and older than the flow of human blood in human veins. My soul has grown deep like the rivers. I bathed in the Euphrates when dawns were young. I built my hut near the Congo and it lulled me to sleep. I looked upon the Nile and raised the pyramids above it. I heard the singing of the Mississippi when Abe Lincoln went down to New Orleans, and I've seen its muddy bosom turn all golden in the sunset. I've known rivers, ancient dusky rivers. My soul has grown deep like the rivers. And so that poem and its diasporic understanding from Harlem, USA, takes us to another Negro metropolis, Southside Chicago, and Gwendolyn Brooks much later writing a poem that I think is in direct relationship to The Negro Speaks of Rivers, and that is her poem sometimes called Kojo and sometimes called I Am a Black. According to my teachers, I am now an African American. They call me out of my name. Black is an open umbrella. I am black and a black forever. I am one of the blacks. We are here, we are there, we occur in Brazil, in Nigeria, Ghana, in Botswana, Tanzania, in Kenya, in Russia, Australia, in Haiti, Soweto, in Grenada, in Cuba, in Panama, Libya, in England, and Italy, France. We are graces in any places. I am black and a black forever. I am other than hyphenation. I say proudly, my people. I say proudly, our people. Our people do not disdain to eat yams or melons or grits or to put peanut butter in stew. Go, Miss Brooks. I am Kojo. In West Africa, Kojo means uncomparable. My parents named me the seventh day from my birth in black spirit, black faith, black communion. I am Kojo, I am a black, and I capitalize my name. Do not call me out of my name. So this Langston, this Gwendolyn, allowed me to understand myself as diasporic, that wherever the slave ship landed, that whomever my native people called themselves, that whoever enslaved my ancestors, that I was someone of the diaspora. Langston allowed me to understand myself as Puerto Rican. I'm not Puerto Rican. For my first Langston. I never didn't know Langston Hughes. We were from Harlem, USA, and Langston was our familiar bard, though my parents did not know him. I did not study him in school. He came to me as part of the great Negro tradition of home space education and corrective autodidacticism, the parallel PhDs we have in our traditions, depending on when we were born. Family bookshelf African Americanists in the great term of my beloved forever colleague, Robert Steptoe. My father would sometimes intone in what he called his Shakespearean voice, "I've known rivers, ancient dusky rivers," in a parody of grandiloquence that was also the beautiful irreverent play that came from having great respect for a tradition that was one to respect and to play with. He would then give a churchly hum, for Langston was gospel. But the book that I remember our having in my home was this one, The Panther and the Lash. This is my first Langston. And it's such an interesting example of what to come to first, because as you know, this is a book that was the last book that he published, and it was a combination of older poems and newer poems. So 1967, here we have a long and perennial vision of Negro struggle that is absolutely concurrent with poems written in a contemporary moment of black struggle. And we see him as quite a political pugilist here. This was the Langston who was useful in my late 1960s black nation-building childhood when we moved to Washington, D.C., being raised by radically free black people. Carry a crisp 20 in case you need to say fuck you, black daddy. Carry a pearl-handed, hidden oyster knife, black mommy. A political pugilist, as I say, terrifyingly elegant shade thrower, that would be my mommy, servants of the people, Clifford and Adele. So that's who raised me, and this is what we had in the house, and this vision was one that served us very well. And one of my dad's mantras from The Panther and the Lash is the poem Slow, Go Slow, excuse me. And he used to sometimes recite this when he would be disgusted by something and say, you know, you gotta act. Go slow, they say, while the bite of the dog is fast. Go slow, I hear, while they tell me, you can't eat here, you can't live here, you can't work here, don't demonstrate, wait, while they lock the gate. Am I supposed to be God or an angel with wings and a halo on my head while jobless I starve dead? Am I supposed to forgive and meekly live, going slow, 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 slow? So that was one of the texts that I grew up in, and now that I look back on it, understanding a little bit more about its making, it stands as kind of a changing same of struggle in black racial progress, and a need to look and pause at this moment and understand that even in his last moment, that the continuity, that one of the many through lines of Langston is a voice raised for black struggle. 5, Caro Langstonia. And this is just delight. I'm going to read you a letter from Langston Hughes to Carl Van Vechten, and Van Vechten replied with that particular, you know, in their letters they played with what they called each other. So Caro Langstonia was how he replied to him. And this is my favorite of the letters. I've read them all. This is my favorite one. And there are just some things I want you to listen for. I want you to, you know, this is queer Langston, this is camp Langston, this is Negro shade Langston. In this, you should also listen for a very, very keen and nuanced understanding of various social strata of white people and black people, an understanding of what it means to be in and outside of propriety, and also, quite amazingly, a prescient vision of something that was not visible at that time, which is what would it mean for his work and for black people's work to live in perpetuity. So listen for all those things and more. Dear Carl, Really should not tell me you are going to give all my letters to Yale, because I will now become self-conscious and no doubt verge toward the grandiloquent. Besides, I was just about to tell you about a wonderful fight that took place in Togo's pool room in Monterey the other day, in which various were cut from here to yonder, and the lady who used to be the second wife of Noel's valet, who came to New York with him that time, succeeded in slicing several herself. But you know that the race would come out here and cut me if they knew I was relaying such news to posterity via the Yale Library. So now how can I tell you? Meanwhile, I have come across Miss Etta Moten's home address, which is 3548 Vernon, Chicago, Illinois. She recently gave 2 concerts here on the coast, but did not pass by Carmel, so I didn't get a chance to ask her about her father. I will be delighted to have my manuscripts in a handsome box with a leather label. But if I were to send you all of them, you would need a trunk, so I will only send certain ones from time to time. The other day, I sent another one called Passing, about some Negroes who wanted to jive some white folks but got double jived themselves. You know I have all your letters, too, and most of your books, even if they are well-worn from being lent out. I have a whole series of letters from Ezra Pound, too, about getting Frobenius translated in entirety into English that might also be good for Yale. He's being funny there. And some from Zora that would be excellent for some PhD to get his degree on in 2042. Happy to say that already happened. Sure, I would love to have a little short job at Yale. Out of my next job, I promise to pay off all the rest of my debts. CLR James, this is 1941, I should say. CLR James I met in Paris, also I believe again in Los Angeles. He was the leading colored Trotskyite of the English-speaking world. Said to be very brilliant, but he does not seem to have much of a sense of humor. And I do not believe he would go near Togo's pool room in Monterey, which is where Fanny cut Virgil in the phone booth the other day, and someone else cut a soldier among others. And Argyle was cut on the arm, and they put it in a sling, but when he got home, he found he had also been cut in the side. But the very thought of Yale prevents me from going further. Thanks so much for reading the new poems for Shakespeare in Harlem. I hope they go into it. And I am dying to see the drawings. I did not think the ones in Golden Slippers very good. I haven't seen George's Joint nor Royal Road yet, but I've read reviews of them and publicity blurbs. And I hope and even beg and entreat via letters to the entire Keynote staff. So here's something really interesting, too, about how he's understanding how his work is going out into the world, that nobody will, in publicizing my book or writing the blurb, use the words childlike, primitive, unmoral, amoral, or simple, which aside from being untrue when applied to the American scene, have been quite worn out in describing Negroes and books by and about Negroes. As Ruth Chatterton's mother said when she tripped over the rug in the foyer on West 55th Street, merde alors, only I too would say it in English were it not that Yale has now got me cornered. Besides, the NAACP has just asked me to write a credo for them to open all their meetings with from Boston to San Diego, and people who write credos would hardly cuss in English, would they? They say when Virgie came out of the phone booth, her coup was in ribbons, which reminds me of why Mamie Smith never made any more records. My love to Fania, sincerely, Langston. So I think that is just an amazing, amazing delight, and that was queer Langston. 6, Langston as legacy, MSH. I lost 3 teachers in 2016-2017, Michael Harper, Derek Walcott, and Gloria Naylor. And I want to turn to Michael Harper, who would surely be with us if he were still walking the earth, and whiz with us as a way to think about the ongoing legacy of Langston Hughes. My own path to poetry was first lit by an avuncular pen pal, and that is Michael Harper, to whom I began writing after hearing him read my work when I was in college. He kindly wrote me back on his signature plain écru Brown University postcards when I would chatter away to him in letters and my own postcards, asking incessant questions about his indelible poems. The first question I ever asked him was, I've noticed that your line, Black Human History, Apple Tree, echoes Langston Hughes's Night Coming Tenderly, Black Like Me, in rhythm and rhyme, which was a good observation. And then I said, have you read it? Oh, no. I was a child. And so that was before I realized that ancestral echoes in poetry usually make their way in of their own accord. I would meditate for hours on the koans that Michael would send my way. Sometimes you need to get sick, he told me once. Though I'm still not sure I totally understand all the possibilities of that utterance, I knew I was lucky that Michael Harper took me for a serious young person. The first time I heard John Coltrane was in a classroom at Yale University in a seminar with the late Professor Michael Cook, and the class was called Problems in the Study of Afro-American Literature. And I was, same year, 19 years old. And by way of introducing us to Michael Harper's poetry, Professor Cook put on Coltrane's A Love Supreme on the record player he brought into the classroom and played it for us all the way through, listening with his eyes closed, feeling and interpretation flickering across his face. Though I cannot now imagine not knowing that music in my bones, I remember the feeling of simultaneous newness. I had never heard sounds like these, and ancientness. I was hearing something profoundly spiritually familiar with which I felt immediately intimacy. And from this, Professor Cook had us read out the eponymous title of Harper's iconic poem from his debut collection, Dear John, Dear Coltrane, and I came all the way out of myself when I heard Professor Cook read, Why you so black? 'Cause I am. Why you so funky? 'Cause I am. Why you so black? 'Cause I am. Why you so sweet? 'Cause I am. Why you so black? 'Cause I am. A love supreme, a love supreme. Blackness had been interrogated and remained standing as essential self, Coltrane self, Harper self, Hughes self, poet self, self. Blackness and surpassing love supreme aligned and sung. Shortly thereafter, when Harper came to campus and gave a reading in the Trumbull College living room, where Cook was college master, as heads of college were called at the time, Michael Harper was the biggest man I'd ever seen, Goliath, linebacker, chieftain, elm. He wore, as I recall, a bright red chamois shirt. He introduced his poems with short meditative lessons on the historical and cultural figures who populated them, along with some of his koans, and then in a voice as deep and rich as whiskey or midnight or Alaga syrup read out those poems. And so I wrote him afterwards, and at finishing up more with that postcard, I said, I think that you are mirroring the patterns that conclude Langston Hughes's dream variations after the speaker has described dancing beneath a small, tall, slim tree. I later learned he chuckled when he read that, knowing as I now do how these things seep in, and yet also that he did tell me later, of course, beyond when I needed to be told, that it was Langston Hughes who made him possible as I was made possible by him. He was never my classroom teacher, but he was my most important teacher to my poetry. We corresponded with all those postcards from 1985 forward. And there are so many of us who passed through actual apprenticeship with him at Brown, and of course Herman is here among the many, but also many of us who he brought into his circle and with whom he shared his wisdom and admonitions. To the koans, pace yourself, kiss yourself. Did you have it recorded? Now thinking of Haydn's October, its plangency, its glow. Today is X's natal day. Always the urging, have you read this, called that one, interviewed an elder, it's a wise blues that knows its father. And this, my favorite email subject lines when he turned somewhat to email. This is a subject line. So many interiors in the imagination are the setting for recorded and unrecorded sounds, semicolon, when young I parsed sonics to rhyme with tonics. The magic waters of resilience, tradition, change, joie de vivre, home cooking, come on home. That's a subject line of an email. Yep. Each one made you meditate and think. Each one has as much unknown as known. Each one required work as well as giving pleasure. Relentless poetics, relentlessness about history in a way you need to be if you're writing about America and trying to stem the turn-back tide, and the poems, often in two-line stanzas, are clean in their fullness, and that is the legacy of Langston. He loved his father and revered his mother, and those of us who loved him well knew that he was elusive and had been for years that he was cantankerous. To be American and alert is to carry rage and necessitates the calling of names. He made articulate a rage that hummed and simmered beneath Hughes. And that's the thing I want us to think about that I think is really interesting. Is it about American history, or is it about a poetic sensibility that meant that Michael Harper names the rage that simmers and isn't named in the same way in Langston Hughes, but they're absolutely connected. Michael used his established and tenured position at Brown University strategically on behalf of black culture. He believed in the value institutions could confer, and so he played that game. Honorary degrees for Sterling Brown and Barbara Hayden, Sterling Brown winning the National Book Award. He always told the story of Gwendolyn Brooks writing him after being a judge for the contest when his first book did not win, and saying, "You were my first choice." Michael was all about redistributing power, correcting the historical record so that cultural history would begin to have the integrity and logic that would make sense for generations to come. That is what I think his project was. In his poems, Michael Harper claimed America. He claimed Langston Hughes' America. He wrote it and rewrote it. He explored its boundaries and plumbed its depths. He wrote its history. He believed in its greatness and possibility. He called out its hypocrisies. He cocked an ear to its sounds and songs. He believed it whole if frayed. He believed it black at the center. And the same could be said, though the sounds are different, of Langston Hughes. And so this is the poem of Michael's that I first wrote to him about, and its ending now holds lifetimes more than I discerned when I was 19. Black bodies as historical bodies, history as myth-making, black history as bruise, the inseparableness of blackness and humanness in need of pronouncement, the body and story ever of the earth. So this is Michael Harper. As black man, I steal away in the night to the apple tree. Place my arm in the rich grave, black sachem on a family plot. Take up a chunk of apple root, let it become my skeleton, become my own myth, my arm the historical branch, my name the bruised fruit. Black human photograph, apple tree. It is a blessing to be a student outside the strictures of the classroom. I was a student who presented it myself to him and did not go away, and so he was my teacher. If love supreme is the guide, the most important words are the chant he knew, the words his daughter Rachel tells us continued to fill the air at the moment and after he took his last breath. A love supreme, words to bring you in and take you out of this life. From Harper, I learned the encompassing might of jazz. He brought the jazz poem forward in a handoff from Langston Hughes. I now see we all have themes. We repeat ourselves. Harper was a great lover of Yeats, and I think the circus animal's desertion, in which Yeats wrote, "I sought a theme and sought for it in vain, and what can I but enumerate all themes," is a way of marking that plumbed dictionary that we visit and revisit, our totems, those well-loved precious books that we return to over and over again, but in different variations, and that over the course of looking at the life of a really great writer, a really great poet who leaves us so much, it's fascinating to think not just about the distinctions of individual poems, but actually to look at as strength and not as, kind of compulsion repetition, those great and important themes. Some people feel like your kin. And from Michael S. Harper, I learned being a poet is responsibility. It's a commitment. You have to carry that responsibility with you. And from him, I learned you have to call the names of your ancestors. 7. It's gonna move. Langston as experimental poet number 2, just a little quick squib, Jimmy Durante, Marlene Dietrich, Mary McLeod Bethune. Langston's last poem, major poem, Ask Your Mama, is something that is now being written about, but I think was confounding when we looked at it at first next to some of the other Langston lyrics. How do you read it? Do you read both sides at once? Do you need more than one person? What do you do with that? And I think that it is another one of these beautiful openings and experiments that he is giving us, where he's thinking about later in his career how you can bring musical forms into poetic form and how that might work. And so as a poet, I am looking for what helps me write a better poem, what pushes me to new possibility, and what challenges me out of my ruts. And that might be found in poems that look like me, and very often in the poems where the connection is not immediately apprehensible and perhaps is invisible. Thinking about belonging to a community, a fellowship is one thing, but belonging to a school of writing, I think, ultimately makes writers feel limited and rebellious, underestimated, and only partially heard. There is always space between what we read about poets and their work and the wider range of influences on them. We can't ever see all of the influences, literary and not. And so here, to the title of this little section, is a statement that Langston Hughes made in an autobiographical sketch about his likes, dislikes, and influences. Quote, Langston, "My chief literary influences have been Paul Laurence Dunbar, Carl Sandburg, and Walt Whitman." Makes sense? "My favorite public figures include Jimmy Durante, Marlene Dietrich, Mary McLeod Bethune, Mrs. Franklin D. Roosevelt, Marian Anderson, and Henry Armstrong. I live in Harlem, New York City. I am unmarried. I like Tristan, Goat's Milk, short novels, lyric poems, heat, simple folk, boats, and bullfights. I dislike Aida, parsnips, long novels, narrative poems, cold, pretentious folk, buses, and bridges." Jimmy Durante, so go factor that into a conversation about Hughes's poetics. But actually, it's not hard to do if you think about Just Be Simple and Madame Alberta K. Johnson, about Hughes's lifelong exploration of the important role of black humor and the centrality of humor to black expressive culture, and about the daring that it took to bring humor into the poker-faced space of the upright and upstanding race poem, and about his interest in everyman characters. So I could go on, but I think that what's really interesting is in charting influence on black poets relative to each other and in conversation with other canons is still nascent work and in need of really wonderful, careful thinking. 8, Langston in the World, brilliant Winona Bond. The truest and most light-filled words I know came from my late grandmother, Winona Bond Logan, and I think about the things that she said each and every day, though she has been gone for many years now. Rather than praise individual acts, she never praised me or the people she loved. She always asked, did you do your best? Did you come prepared? Did you make the best of your day? She was reared in the segregated South in the early part of the 20th century, and in the face of racist words and deeds would say calmly, "Isn't it a pity they are so very limited?" And when, as a young woman, told her endlessly of racist affronts, she would rhetorically ask, what does his or her ignorance have to do with you? And why are we talking about this? It has nothing to do with you. Move quickly past the inevitable slights we all face in the name of various ignorances, and do not let the toxins take resident in your psyche. That's some black feminist theory right there. Concentrate instead on how to be just and compassionate and humble. She believed in the word and in precision with the word. All you have is your word, she would say, and your reputation will be made by your word. I have taken that and applied it to the art of writing poetry. Her dictum on the word helps me understand the ethics of writing poetry, the ethics of searching for each perfect and precise word with which to reach across the human void and offer a piece of oneself to each other. That is how human beings connect, with the word. And finally, her very best sartorial advice: after you get dressed in the morning and before you leave the house, look in the mirror and take off one thing. She believed that over-accessorizing was tacky, and so I still find myself checking in my work for over-embellishment and aspiring to her own understated elegance. Precision, the finest word, the finest accessory, the one necessary detail, being open and alert to revelation, listening between the lines, gleaning meaning from gesture and what is left unsaid. In just about the same year that Langston Hughes was cut off by his father, left Columbia University, and threw his books overboard and set sail for ports unknown, my grandmother, Winona Bond, would follow her imagination. When her family moved to Washington, D.C., she told me she used to sit on the steps of the U.S. embassies and imagine herself elsewhere. She would roller skate to the segregated library and sit on those steps and imagine what was held between the pages inside. She'd seen a picture in 1915 of the Little Mermaid being built in Copenhagen Harbor and decided she wanted to go there. So she found a university in Denmark and wrote them and said, I am what is known as an American Negro, and I imagine you have never had one. Will you send a passage for me to come study? And they did. And so I recently found from someone who is doing scholarly research on black people in Denmark and Scandinavia, An article that was published in the Black Press, and the headline is Brilliant Winona Bond. Miss Winona Bond tells of experiences in Europe. I'm going to read you a little piece of this. After 17 months spent in Europe, Miss Winona Bond, Girl Reserve Secretary of the YWCA, New York City, has returned home. She studied on 2 scholarships while away. She was awarded through the first scholarship through the Urban League to study, so that's interesting, I didn't know that part, to study in Helsingfors, Denmark for 5 months. While in Denmark, she was awarded another scholarship to study at Wadhobrecht settlement in Birmingham, England for 10 months. At the close of school, she spent some time on the continent before resuming her work in New York, which has been temporarily filled during her absence. Such an interesting letter was loaned to us to read that we begged the privilege from a friend to publish it. And these are just a few of her notes when she came back. Being back in, I'm sorry, this print could not be made any larger. Being back in the hauntingly familiar yet amazingly unfamiliar atmosphere of New York after 17 months in Europe has somehow carried me at such a pace that I simply did not have time to write this letter. What you'll be interested in hearing about in my experience in Denmark and in England, what I cannot help thinking about and marveling at is the economic situation in New York. Actually, the world is such a comparatively intimate community now that most problems are too universal to be looked at from merely a national standpoint. International labor problems, history, the League of Nations, economics, and other similar courses I took last year, and the international atmosphere in which I lived seems intimately connected with a new New York to which I have returned. And then she goes on, and it's too small to read, but she talks about how meeting people of other cultures and realizing that it is at the intimate level that people have to solve their problems and what it means to come back home and understand and be aflame with the idea that the world is a united place. And she's writing this in the 1920s. Seemed extraordinary. And she was that person to me at the same time that Langston Hughes was understanding himself as a black person in the world. I have carried around for years the idea that I want to write an opera about a black magician named Black Herman, who traveled the world himself at about the same time, settling at around the same time as Langston and my grandmother in the global metropolis that is Harlem, USA. He came out of time and space of tremendous racial violence, lynchings, and race riots. His signature magician's act, Black Herman, is that he could make himself disappear, which seems like the dream of what it meant to rise up and out of the imminent bodily harm of being black in America and be elsewhere, the power of mind and imagination. Like Langston, like brilliant Winona Bond, he up and left the body in constraint. He disappeared. Langston as philosopher. Langston's poetry crystallizes deep truths from within and gives us the means to that central access of what you believe, not creed or anthem, but rather the quieter voice of belief, the substance of things hoped for. This poem by Langston Hughes gives us one set of words to live by. Motto, I play it cool and dig all jive. That's the reason I stay alive. My motto, as I live and learn, is dig and be dug in return. But then there's also this one, which I really love. This is I think my favorite Langston poem, which moves us toward the mysteries of good fortune in this world, a true question for leaders to meditate on creatively. Luck. Sometimes a crumb falls from the tables of joy. Sometimes a bone is flung. To some people, love is given. To others, only heaven. Why, the child asks, do some people starve while others have more than they need? Why are some endowed when others are not? Why didn't the slaves all run away, my children asked, when they were first old enough to begin to be exposed to that long, dark era in our history and its fallout? To answer these questions requires more than mere knowledge and facts. The empirical doesn't answer the why, though without it we are lost. In poetry, I find the meditative invitation to begin to consider the very hardest questions. And when I write a poem into a question, I write it because I do not know the answer, but because I know the poem will help take me there in the way of Hughes. Knowing is a process. Then to conclude, Langston stays the course. What are you writing? I am often asked. I'm often defensive, even angry. Email, I would say, when I chaired African American Studies, trying not only to build the department, but also the larger field. Strategy, I now say, having spent the last few years learning philanthropy at the Ford Foundation in a new career. But in the intervening years, while doing other things in my life besides writing, things happened that called me surprisingly to writing. Living and facing dying brought me to write an unexpected memoir, The Light of the World. My friend, the singer Alicia Hall Moran, said, "When I sang at my mother-in-law's funeral, then I knew why I sang. Then I finally knew what song is for." What is it to be a poet? What is it if it is a state, a condition, a self, not a job or an activity? Is it about the day-to-day of making poems? Is it about something else? Who are we if we are not making poems in the day-to-day? I have not been making poems in the day-to-day for a very long time. My friend Terrence Hayes says, "You move through the world and enter the room with poet's eyes." My friend Robin Coss Lewis says, "Poems are overrated, girl." I say to myself, I will not make a fetish of any object. I will not be deluded as to my purpose and work by the satisfaction of well-made objects, let alone critical reception. I will embrace not writing and see what is in the space there. What is it to be a poet? What does it mean to me? I have a tribe. I live in community. I belong to people I do not know. We look at the world askew. We vision that which others cannot see. We are artists. You never know what we have on underneath our trench coats. So to talk about staying the course as a writer, about genre, and about remaining open to uncertainty and discovery as a writer, Langston showed us that living life in the word is how you stay the course. Langston did not make a fetish of any form. Langston moved between forms as appropriate, always reinventing, always learning, moving, gigging, finding new sounds, exploring new genres, living and making and living by the word. When did you know you were a poet? I am often asked, and I usually answer that when I was a child, I collected words, devoured books, and loved to listen to people talk and tell stories. I was a child who went reluctantly and fitfully to sleep, uncertain of what was there. But the mornings were a wonder, because I woke not only alive but myself, knowing I had been somewhere amazing, that there was a subterranean world that was not always accessible to me in the minute by minute, but was complete and expressed itself in visual images, music, and at the forefront in words. I visited that dream space and came out with an acceptance of the surreality that presented itself in the daylight in my mind. In college, I wrote fiction and was then a newspaper writer for a stretch. Writing essays and critical writing were a constant, and then found my way really to poetry as such when I was 23 and learned that it was my true self, my home base as a writer. Poems and poems, books and books, a struggle each time, but the work went on. But when I mapped the years, as I feel like I can now map the years a little bit, and mapping the years next to the years that Langston had, he died on the younger side. There are a lot of interesting things on that continuum. Teaching and its attendant wonders, academic administration, poetry, world mentoring and building, institution building, work on behalf of field, one child, then a second, extended family responsibilities. When my husband and love died unexpectedly, the encompassing work of grieving. I might like to think that my life is one book lined up after another, but really, as all of our lives, it is a jagged path. I look at the work of three of my touchstones, June Jordan, Adrienne Rich, and Lucille Clifton. I look at the work of Audre Lorde, and I see the same jagged path through writing in different forms, rearing children, learning the self, tending the sometimes fragile body, evolving with self and time and in community, building something more than themselves. Zora wrote, "There are years that ask questions and years that give answers. Some years have books, and some years have babies, and some years have bounty, and some years have loss, and some years feel like someone has died or was born even if it literally didn't happen." I look to Jordan and Rich and Clifton and Lorde to study the years and think about the ways they have evolved and they have stayed the course. I never imagined that when I wrote first one word and then another in the wake of the sudden loss of my husband, that I was beginning the process of writing a memoir, let alone a memoir that would make its way into the world and connect me to so many people and stories. Braced by my writing hand on the dining room table, I felt I was literally making sounds, not even words, one by one, until they became fragments, then sentences, then something whole that told me not what I was feeling, but rather what was happening at the most basic level. Earth will hold me, I would tell myself as I wrote, as I lay on the floor between sentences and reminded myself I was alive, I was two people's mother, I could think and breathe and write even as I felt the earth had been swept out from beneath me. And such was the state in which I began The Light of the World when I finished it, after sharing it at 2 junctures with my sons, for I would not have put it forth in the world without their assent. I did not feel that it had been cathartic, as many quite reasonably asked me. And it was not poems. It was a memoir, a form that felt too public and explicit to me, but I knew I had written my way through a stretch. I knew why I sang. A stretch in the road of my life, and that each word was a necessary step forward to the next station, the next stage, brief poet's chapter by brief poet's chapter. And as I let myself inhabit standing inside a new genre, I realized that perhaps my sense of the sanctity of genre ought to come under a bit of pressure. What might happen with a story that didn't inhabit the vessel of the poem? And what might I learn, and in that process learn how tragedy completely remade me? As much as The Light of the World is a love story that begins with 2 people and tells a particular story about a particular man and family, I wanted those particulars to radiate outward and be meaningful in ever-widening circles, because loss is our common denominator. None of us will escape it. None of us will outrun death. It is it has black particularity, but it is more of a common denominator even than the encompassingness and joy of being black. What do we do in the space between death and being born that is our lives? What is the quality and richness? How do we move through struggle and let community hold us when we've been laid low? The book had to live someplace outside the sound of my own voice, to paraphrase the poet Sekou Sundiata, another dear one gone too soon. It had to be larger than me and my individual love. So I took to the road with the book like the constantly sojourning Langston. Many things happened that were profound. I might have expected to connect with other widows who read the book and were interested in the demographic commonalities, but I found the human connections far exceeded that boundary. One example only, in Los Angeles, I did a reading with a group called Inside Out Writing that creates writing workshops for incarcerated young people, and then they continue that writing practice when they're released, both as an anti-recidivism method and also to continue to build community. To a full house, I read with some of those young people who shared stories that they wrote of and through while incarcerated. 2 of them interviewed me with tremendous care and closed the interview by thanking me in their languages, Tagalog and Korean, recasting my late husband's polyglot mantra that I described in the book. He was a man who, because of being a refugee and because of colonialism and because of his own wild mind, spoke 8 languages. And he would always say, what could be more important than saying thank you in someone's original language? What is so hard about learning how to say thank you in another language? A young man who joined the program while a teenager in prison gave me a bag filled with glitter in which was a tiny glass bottle with a cork plug. The plug was a computer drive, and his own poems jumped up onto my screen when I plugged it in, a life in verse, someone else who was moving forward with writing and with the word. In simplicity, and we're almost done, is such guiding truth. I turn again to the spirituals in a way that I had not ever before this tragedy and writing this book. This little light of mine could also be an epigraph to the book if it were not understood as being simply a merry exhortation. Because that song, after all, was best known as an anthem during the mighty struggles of the civil rights movement. That beautifully repeated, let it shine, let it shine, let it shine, performs the will to live in the context of mighty life and death struggle. The word shine is bright radiance itself. For some years, I have thought I may never write a poem, and of late I think, what if I never write another book? Writing is writing. I do not believe things that are not writing are writing. But I believe the larger questions are about staying the course. And the things that I've learned from writing a book from the inside out are the things that seem most human and important. What does writing, the act of writing, living by the word, help you understand? I ask you this. How is art a companion? What are the blessings of craft, of having a craft to practice which allows you to understand more keenly what you feel and inventory what you know? How, Langston, does genre matter and not matter? How, Langston, do you always know more than you think you do on the surface? How, even in poems that seem to have a simple service, is it about writing about the deep soul practice of diving into the wreck, in Adrian Rich's words, exploring the wreck itself and not the story of the wreck? There are sureties that come with life, and we ride them like lifeboats. The act of making art, the courage of it, is challenging the sureties and going out into the deep, deep ocean of unknowing. How, Langston, do you continue to live like that? The challenge is staying the course, and the story is told in more than just the poems and more than just the books. I live with other human beings, or I did every day until 7 weeks ago when my second child left me to join his brother in college. But for today's purposes, I'll just say I live with 2 human beings. And when I started to sketch out some of these thoughts, that then big old 17-year-old human being came right into my space as I was writing. That would be Simon, telling me the story. Mama, I had an amazing dream last night. A dream, he told me, that took a cathartic journey from being terrorized to being the hero and saving his family. He tells his dreams in vivid detail. I turned from my own words to listen. So the latest book, The Light of the World, existed in my own body. It existed in a dream, and now it connects and continues to connect with others, making an ever-widening human circle. Our individual lights are very, very small compared to all the light in the world. So every day, in some way, I go to work, following the example of the perennial Langston Hughes, who lived by the word and what it carried. The word was Langston's life companion, tool, weapon, heart, soul, his people distilled and true in every syllable. Thank you. Thank you. So, thank you, and thank you for listening so attentively to a long meditation, and I'm really eager to have a conversation and to hear your thoughts and questions. We're having a Q&A, right? Yeah. Yeah. Okay, great. I would love to hear your thoughts. We can hear each other, yeah. Thoughts? Any questions? Sure, absolutely. Life is so short. Yes, please. Thank you. Loudly.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
I've never stood up first. I'm thinking through my question. Okay, is this better? Yes. Thank you. Yeah, so I'm thinking through my question, and I just told her how amazing it was. I've never stood up first. So I was thinking through a poem that I was writing as I was responding to you and thinking about where a difference, I think, is in our formation. And because, you know, love, it can also be forged out of difference. And it was interesting to me that it's the word that helped form you. And as you were talking, I realized how central the sound is to my formation. And you had these moments at the end where the word and the sound, right, as you were thinking about the song, came together, and I don't really have a question, I just want to kind of engage a conversation, hopefully. But I remember as a kid, so I'm Trini, wasn't born in Trinidad, born in Puerto Rico, but I'm Trini.
So this may take a minute.
My mom is Trini. Forgive me. I'm thinking it through. I said that. I started there. But I remember hearing Coltrane as a kid. Going to school, talking Spanish, coming home, talking Trinidadian English to my mom, but listening to Coltrane, listening to Otis Redding, listening to soca, listening to Spanish music. And it's the sound that oriented me and not the word. I'm trying to figure out a question, but there's something about that conflation with the sound or with song and the word that you did that struck me as there was something happening there that was different for me, and I'm just wondering, how did you work that out? That's my question. Is that so?
Well, I think that what you're, of course, before the word there's sound, and I think that when we make poems, we're always making them with our ears. We're always trying to make music. We're always trying to make something that aspires to the condition of music, whatever that might look like. And I think that that's part, what our primary tool is as poets is how do you make music? And in order to do that, it can't just be about the word itself. It has to be about sound in some kind of way. I think that also what you're talking about is a kind of, and I guess for me an interesting question is how do we have diasporic understanding that is collective and nuanced at the same time, right? We can talk in great nuance about the distinction between, rice and beans and peas and rice and hop and john, and we must know those nuances and distinctions. But isn't it also interesting the way we eat that connects us because it has historical, social, cultural, economic history that binds it? I mean, that's not telling this audience anything new, but I think that in thinking about, kind of what next generation diaspora studies are going to look like, that being able to, kind of have political solidarity where it's needed. And I think, I come out of the Gwendolyn Brooks place, right, in that poem of hers, that poem Kojo. But at the same time, how can we learn and listen and nuance the very, very detailed particulars of, and what Coltrane gets to, people probably saw, as I did this week, that amazing, beautiful, beautiful documentary, so he's more on my mind than usual even. But in thinking about, just the soul stir of those sounds, and, what does it mean when we hear it and it stirs us that way? It doesn't stir everybody that way necessarily. It doesn't stir all black people that way necessarily. But I know I had what I can only describe as a very atavistic experience when I heard it for the first time. It was speaking to something deeply inside, and I still experience it that way. So maybe that also is, to think about our black geniuses and what they are listening for. In the documentary, you see where he's woodshedding, and he, kind of wanders off and plays. He's listening for something, and he brings something back. And a whole nother conversation is the Alice documentary that we are waiting for after seeing that. So, that's just kind of a response to your meditation.
Thank you, Elizabeth, for that wonderful presentation. I kept thinking of place, and particularly when you were talking about Miss Brooks having been to Chicago, and we could never call her Gwendolyn. Miss Brooks.
I did that by mistake once. Just now, I said Gwendolyn. I was like, I don't say that. I say Miss Brooks.
Yes, Miss Brooks. And thinking about again, Professor Hayden. When I was a student at Michigan, I always thought of him as a Detroit poet. The spaces that these poets write in, they're specific, but they're universal. But the settings, whether you think of Miss Brooks as a Topeka, or you think of Miss Brooks as a Southside Chicagoan, or Professor Hayden, or even the other student of Michael Harper, Gail Jones, as a Kentuckian. I mean, they come out of real specific places, and I just wondered, what does place mean for Langston? Is he this Midwesterner? Is he a New Yorker? What Harlem seems to be central to him. What does space mean, and what does space mean in your own writing?
Yeah, well, I think that it's so interesting in Langston Hughes, right? Because when you look at and that's why, and it's just sort of a little glancing, it's not even really a section, but just that moment, that Mexico moment that I mentioned, and really trying to think about what it means to grow up in more than one culture and more than one language, and more than when what it means to be black is so defining in different spaces. So, I mean, I think that's why, place is so important to black folks, because our visible public selves mean very particular things in particular places. And I think also when you think about, if you think about the Great Migration as also, if you, say, does the word refugee ever apply? Does the word, Farrah's here, leaving, a state-sanctioned terrorist violence, how are these people not just, upturned faces, but also, displaced people? And what do you carry with you when you move to the next place? So, because what we know of the vast numbers of us who were in that displacement, I think the urgency of how you make yourself in new place, how you make yourself in segregated communities, so that maybe there's kind of a vortex of what that thing that is your culture looks like, are some of the things that I think about. But to Langston, and why I put him with my amazing grandmother, she was from Selma, Alabama, and then they moved to Birmingham, and then they ended up moving to DC. But she always, from a little girl in Selma, had a sense of elsewhere. And that when their lives were very segregated and constrained, I mean, like really, you read about the Little Mermaid statue being built, and you were in segregated, and you imagined you might get there, and you figured out how to get there. I mean, who are you really? But similarly, I think to Langston, the continents he had been to when he was 19 years old. And how does all of that, what I think is so interesting about Langston Hughes is the simmer, is all of the things. There's a million herbs in that soup, but then what we experience is very, very clear. But there are so many things in cells that are underneath. I think to Harlem, USA, to Harlem in the world, I mean, it is a global Negro metropolis. And so I think that the beauty of Harlem once it became black, the eternal black beauty of Harlem, is the worldness and the localness that is so powerfully in it. And of course also in Harlem, USA, unlike, not better or worse, but unlike Southside Chicago, you do have black people occurring, as Brooks would say, in so many different languages. In Harlem, so that becomes another interesting way of understanding oneself as very rooted and very local, but also very global. I was born in Harlem. My parents are from Harlem. We moved to DC when I was little. My brother was born in DC. He always loves to just call me out and say, "You all Harlem, how long did you live there?" And I was like, "Well, they were 2 very relevant years." But the point is, that was who my parents were. That was who we were. That was who we were. And we were always visiting, but also the me who I became claimed it. And it was a Valhalla. It was a way of saying, yes, this is who I am, but this is also who I imagine myself to be. So I think that how we create the self is the most interesting question of all. Yeah. Yes. Yes. Oh, yeah. Yes. Hmm?
I also appreciated your emphasizing the diasporic multilingual in education.
Bless. Mm-hmm. Well, I'm certainly thinking about that a lot, at this stage of life, and that, when there's a loss that you don't expect, it does change your sense of urgency and also of taking stock, I think. And it's kind of, I'm 55, I think it's time to be doing that now, and to be thinking, okay, what, who are the fellow travelers? Who's still here? Who's not here? Who do we so wish were here? You knew Melvin Dixon. So many people who should be here with us who are not here, and I think that is something that, that increases. Because I think that it's actually frivolous to sit, twiddling my thumbs and worrying about whether or not I wrote a poem today. I actually think that that's just fancy and stupid. I think the important thing is making work, and the important thing is being a useful person, and the important thing is knowing yourself well enough to know when you are avoiding what's hard and instead diving into what's hard. With the work I've been doing for the last few years, it's new stuff. It's philanthropy. It's giving away money to. In a smart way, learning how to do it in a smart way, learning how to advance a cultural vision to support people who are really trying to, make things more fair and more beautiful and more just and more brilliant. So really thinking about, this is sort of the Oprah part, like what is my best and highest purpose right now? How can I be, it's my grandmother, Are you prepared? Did you do your best? Did you try? Were you kind? Were you generous? Did you share? It's really, really, really that stuff that how do you, so sometimes sharing, and I found that in writing, never having written anything, the memoir had a story, so people knew it was a book about someone whose husband died, and that it was a love story. So people come to that in a different way than they come to poems. And it meant that, and so the audience was much, 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 much bigger, and they came for different reasons. And so I really had to humbly see, wow, this book helped people. People, I get letters every single week, and they say, this book helped me. And then they share a story. And so I feel like that was good human activity. And that was something, so to me, the interesting question of Langston, and I'm so eager, when I have time, which I have none of, but, to just luxuriously read Arnold's volumes again. Because I read them when you first wrote them, and I read them for reference, but to really, experience the life, experience the life. I'm very interested in lives, because I think it's also both the micro of how we live every day and then the bigger story of what it adds up to, and sometimes we get too worried about the in-between.
All right, we have Professor Meadow-Jones gets the last question.
No pressure, Wallace. Well, I'll make it short and clear and a real direct question, and it's actually about, and both in honor of Fikre, which is, in your talk, I noticed when you listed your friends, like Robin Castelluzzo and Sir Terence Hayes, who are also, both have written about visual art, and Terence, is also a visual artist, and also in Light of the World, the fact that Fikre was a painter, right, and that you all collaborated, and I'm curious if you could talk about how the visual, because even when you talked about Langston Hughes, you talked about him being, each of us have our image, right, of Langston. So it's a very visual Langston, not just only a sonic Langston. Could you talk about the influence of the visual as you see it, or the painterly, whether it's in Picre in your own work, or as a line that connects us back to Hughes, please? Thank you.
Yeah, I think maybe there's two things about that, or maybe three things. I think that maybe, you know, each of us just has proclivities, right? Like, that girl can really sing. And I am a very good visual analyst. I have a very amazing visual memory. It's just my superpower. It's just a funny thing. I just see very completely and very analytically, and I always have, and I can tell you how I saw things when now, you know, what is it that creates that? I mean, some of it is, again, we have our bents, but also, you know, I mean, well, you both know my mother. You know, I mean, my mother actually was an artist, but also it's more, and I wrote about this in The Black Interior, her altar. You know, she would put on shelves beautiful seashells and rocks and beautifully arranged things that captivated me when I was little. I went to college and took a class with Robert Ferris Thompson. I took, you know, Structure of the New York Mambo, so a story I've told before. My father said, ask your grandfather about the New York Mambo. I'm not paying for a course on the structure of the New York Mambo. That's not a course. And so I went and I took the course, and it rocked my world, and there was tea, and there was everything, and I came home, and I was all like, oh my God, we have so many African retentions. Look what we eat, look what we do, look at the bacon grease, look at all this stuff. And my parents were just like, you know, like, okay, girl, that's quite enough. And I said to my mother, and look, you make Yoruba altars. I said, you make Yoruba altars, it's just like seashell graves. And she said, darling, I don't make Yoruba altars, and I don't make seashell graves. I do neither of those things. But, you know, you know, magic power imbued in objects, a sense of this object and not that object, a sense of this blue and that white. You know, what do we carry that we can't always say where it came from? And so I think that probably I've always sought that sense of visual excitement and felicity and complexity and compellingness, and I like to talk about it.
Thank you. Let's thank Elizabeth Alexander once again. Thank you very much. Thank you, Elizabeth. This talk this evening was just as thrilling as I imagined it. And the thing that came to mind, Elizabeth, as you were talking about, just the way in which you employ memory. And I read your beautiful memoir.